continuing with our discussion of racial projects and how that applies to Asian Americans and Asian American history. Well, a good period in Asian American history to see the fluctuation of racial definitions, in other words, different racial projects that occur, is the period from World War II to the Cold War. And, this is a relatively brief period of time. World War II is the early 40s through 1945. And then we are immediately in the Cold War years from 1945 through the successive decades until the late 80s. So during this period, you'll see fluctuation that we could recognize as racial projects. For example, during World War II, China was an ally of the United States as we fought against the Japanese Empire. And because they were allies of the United States, well, it looked really bad that in our immigration laws we had specifically designated Chinese as ineligible for immigration, right? Barred from entering the United States. So we repealed that law. We repealed the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act during World War II, specifically in 1943, and that was the Magnuson Act, okay? And here you kind of recognize the fact that Chinese are the, quote, good Asians in the context of World War II, right? On the other hand, the Japanese Americans, as we know, well, they're seen as the enemy, of course. But what about Japanese Americans? As we're fully aware of, they are essentialized as, perpetual foreigners, specifically essentially Japanese. And indeed, let's recall General DeWitt's argument that, quote, the racial strains remain undiluted. So that means no matter what, Japanese Americans will always be Japanese and therefore be loyal to the Japanese Empire. And therefore, this justified internment, as we know. So, contrary to the Chinese Americans, who were the good Asians during World War II, the Japanese Americans were the, quote, bad Asians. Now, the Cold War breaks out right with the end of World War II in 1945. And this time, China is our enemy after 1949. Why 1949? Because that's the year that the communist forces in the Chinese Civil War actually won that civil war and therefore established the People's Republic of China. It is communist and therefore an enemy of the United States and the First World. Okay, so they're the bad Asians. They used to be the good Asians just a few years earlier. The Japanese, on the other hand, are recast as good Asians. Okay, all right, so here we see this reconstruction here of the Japanese and the Chinese during the Cold War. Of course, the historical context is crucial here. The Japanese Americans are recast as good Asians, and Chinese Americans recast as bad Asians, okay? By the way, this is a Life magazine article during World War II. This is when the Chinese were the good Asians and the Japanese were the bad Asians. And it says how to tell, quote, Japs from the Chinese. And it says ridiculous things like parchment is yellow complexion, higher bridge on the nose, right? Lighter beard here, or scant beard. It says more frequent epicanthic fold. I know this is hard to read with this image, but this says more frequent epicanthic fold. Epicanthic fold refers to the fold of skin over the eyes that most Asians have that make their eyes look smaller, right? Supposedly, Chinese have, more frequent epicanthic fold compared to the Japanese, supposedly. And also in contrast, the Japanese has a heavier beard, sometimes rosy cheeks. And notice, by the way, the Chinese is smiling here. He's a friendly face, showing a friendly face. Well, this is obviously a scowl, on the Japanese face. So, again, trying to inform Americans during World War II how to distinguish between quote-unquote Japs from the Chinese. Now, World War II ends, as I just mentioned, the Chinese are our enemy and the Japanese are our friends during the Cold War. So again, you have the Japanese Americans recast as model minorities. Okay, and this is interesting because just a few years earlier they were in internment camps, and then all of a sudden this abrupt reversal in perception and image from the mainstream press. Now, Japanese Americans were typecast as obedient, as hardworking, as excelling in academic pursuits. All right. And this is the beginning of that model minority myth, which we're aware of. Okay. It began with the Japanese during the Cold War. The Chinese, on the other hand, well, they are communist, right, in China. So therefore, the Chinese Americans must be communist as well, or so it was believed. In fact, the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover here, um, announced that Chinese Americans, not Chinese, but Chinese Americans, were our quote number one enemy, and he says, quote, some of whom could be susceptible to recruitment either through ethnic ties or hostage situations because of relatives in communist China. So it was believed by Hoover that Chinese Americans could easily become, if you will, a fifth column, right, of spies in the United States. Okay. Another thing that demonstrates the reversal of public perception of the Chinese from good to bad is the Chinese confession program. And this was launched by a government agency called the INS, and this stood for Immigration Naturalization Services. Okay, it's kind of like the equivalent of ICE today. But it was an informal program, that is to say, the Chinese confession program. It was an informal program inaugurated by the INS. Why did this happen? Because of reports of so-called Chinese spies entering the country. And the person who believed this was happening reported it to the government. And this led to the INS going to Chinese communities and basically rounding them up. Okay, they put up posters around the buildings, urging Chinese Americans to report to the INS office if they came in fraudulently into the United States. Now, many came in fraudulently, but it was not because of them being a fifth column, so to speak. It was because they came in fraudulently through other means, okay, which is another discussion, okay? But it was or had nothing to do with the Cold War or them being spies, okay? But still, because they did have that fraudulent history, and by the way, here's a picture of those who reported to the INS, because they did have a fraudulent history of immigration to the U.S., even though they didn't come in as spies, well, you see thousands of them, quote unquote, confessing, right, to the INS, okay? The INS agents would enter Chinatowns, they would stop people on the street, asking for valid documentation. And here's a quote from a resident in Chinatown at that time. And by the way, this happened in the 1950s through the 1960s, the Chinese confession program. According to the resident, quote, they would stop you in the street, harass you, and push you around. It became part of our daily lives in Chinatown at that time. All right, so again, this is at fundamental variance with the Chinese being the good Asians. Right now, they are this, communist ring of spies in the United States. Okay, so let's think about this. Why could you call these occurrences, quote, racial formations? Well, it's because it redefined the racial meaning of both the Chinese and Japanese, right? In the case of the Japanese Americans, they used to be, quote, enemy aliens. Now they are reconstructed to become, quote, model minorities. And again, the state is doing this, right? The media is doing this. And it served, by the way, a political goal here that's tied to the Cold War. The U.S. wanted to demonstrate that racial tolerance was indeed happening in the United States, contrary to the Soviet accusation of the United States being racist. So it was meant to counter that accusation emanating from, Russia and the Soviet Union. Okay, now the Chinese confession program, how is that a racial formation? Well, this program was used by the INS, right, law enforcement, immigration policy, to define Chinese Americans as, suspicious, certainly foreign, communist, right, potentially subversive, right, spies and engaged in sabotage, espionage. And of course, the context here is Cold War fears in domestic society at the time. All right. So this is a racial formation because it assigned Chinese identity a meaning of foreignness and disloyalty, right? And this was an institutionalized racialization, right? Surveillance of the Chinese, the way they rounded them up and interrogated them, right? So again, it reinforced the idea that the Chinese Americans were a group that required some kind of state control, right? Special control and monitoring. And therefore, it was a state driven racial project, right? In that it reorganized Chinese Americans, the Chinese American racial identity, that is, in a specific political context, the Cold War. Okay. So therefore, both projects, they produced and reproduced racial categories through policy, right? Through the confession program, through their promotion as, quote, model minorities. And again, that's the core of racial formation theory.